Mahalo Lele, and welcome everyone to another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Ice podcast. Today, I will be a lone ranger for our live digital kava session today. Mr. Atearoa was here in the United States a week or so ago, and so we spent the majority of the time there. We did release a new episode on the podcast just from a previous live digital kava session, but it's been a couple weeks since we've had a full blown live. So, despite the family obligations that Mr. Atearoa has, we thought it was necessary just to jump on, get through another live digital kava session here, and really have a discussion on a topic that I think is important to understand. We'll be spending some time to walk through the Polynesian language, family tree, language chart, whatever you want to call it. Want to review some of the discussions that I've seen online regarding Polynesian language structure and, certain conclusions that people take from it. There's a specific video that we'll react to um, that we were tagged on, and some of the discussion online has been quote unquote evidence of Hamoa influence throughout Polynesia. Once again, we're not trying to get into a tit for tat. We're really just having a discussion on our history, trying to get a better understanding of our origins, what we were in regards to the culture, the structure of our ancestors from thousands of years ago. It's really important to understand that what that structure looked like. There's a lot of discussions we hear online, and in speeches that, we're one people, which we believe in 100% here on the podcast. But the question becomes, well, if we're one people, where did we come from? Where did our ancestors get this knowledge, this technology? Where did the kingly structure of government come from? Where did the religious aspects of Hikuleo come from? And all of those things that lead us to understand who and what we are. Looks like we have an early comment here from Josh E. Melanesia. I'm assuming that you're kind of responding of where that origin comes from. Josh, that is a very common response that we get, and I understand that the academics push that out as a Southeast Asian migration through Melanesia, then to Polynesia. And we can't argue with the DNA. There's definitely Melanesian DNA, even though the majority of the DNA is Southeast Asian. They've done some of the intense studies, Josh, into the patriarchal DNA strains, the Y, and also the mitochondria. It's overly dominant that the mitochondria is from Southeast Asia, and some of the Y chromosomes or that DNA comes from Melanesia. However, Josh, with that being said, the challenge that we have here is genetic material does not explain the origins of ideas. And I'll explain it to it this way, Josh. If you come to America and you'll find certain genetic materials, that doesn't necessarily give you the origin of the phenomena that's known as the United States, right? What made the United States unique? What, the first experiment into democracy, self-governance, the Constitution of the United States, the three branches of government, and how each branch has its own roles and responsibilities, free market, economics, military, infrastructure, technology. Genetic material doesn't explain that. So we recognize that there is genetic material through Southeast Asia, through Melanesia. But once again, what we're kind of leaning towards is we see that, but we want to understand where the ideas came from. Where did the idea of kings come from? Where did the idea of mound building come from? Where did the idea of religious structure and how astronomical knowledge and religious knowledge was infused into the politics of Polynesia that spread throughout the area? So that's what we're kind of leaning towards, Josh. We understand that, there is definitely a Melanesian tie, but we're trying to go beyond that. So, hey, T-Style, welcome. T-Style says we only connect with Austronesian through languages, genetics. Maybe that's where we're kind of leaning to. We obviously inherited certain words, certain cultural practices, but when we get to the core, and we'll even look at the Austronesian languages here, T-Style, they're really in the Proto-Polynesian, and it spreads out from Melanesian. It doesn't really, there's a huge distinction between our linguistical structure with the Melanesian one. So yeah, let's see here. Water Bears, Malo. He says, none of your ops want to see you live face to face, too scared to show face and share their bizarre ideas. Hey, I am by no means Water Bear claim that all my ideas are unconquerable, right? No one has a perfect record with their ideas. I've had some bad ideas, but I don't have a problem with some of my ideas getting choked out if they don't deserve to win, right? And I don't have an issue with that. However, I am very confident in some of the ideas that I have developed. And those ideas, I'm kind of excited to see them compete. And like you said, I mean, I've consistently invited people who support us, people who criticize us, people who've never heard of us, people who just have a life story. We'll bring them to the table, have those conversations. I don't oppose that. I mean, really, we're not interested in having a debate, so to speak, in an official manner where there's a rebuttal and so forth. People have said things on the podcast that I don't necessarily agree with, but that's fine, right? That's them showing their style, their technique, the competitiveness of their idea. We allow that to be fleshed out as much as possible so that the viewers, the listeners, can see it, can hopefully understand it, and then say, how does that idea compare to this one? Right? It's no different than when we watch a UFC or a boxing match. Some people score each round differently. Some people value different things differently. Some people, I'm definitely much more of a Pacquiao believer. Mr. Aotearoa is much more of a, since he's not here to defend himself, he's much more of a runaway Mayweather fan. But hey, everybody sees it differently. And our goal is just, the more we talk about it, the better chance that the good ideas rise to the top, and the better it is that the bad ideas die. And both are important, right? A good idea rising to the top is just as important as a bad idea just getting drowned and we move on, because bad ideas lead to bad actions and bad beliefs. So appreciate that, Water Bears. Looks like T-Style has a question here. He says, question, if we were to follow the mound building, would that lead us back to Egypt, or do we collectively figure this out? I mean, the interesting thing, T-Style, about the mound building, it does lead back to Egypt, but it also leads to all around the world. That's one of the things that's kind of intriguing about the mound building is you find them in specific areas around the world, all around the world, right? Like throughout the United States, you find them in certain parts of Africa. You find them, you can make the argument. You also find some of them in kind of the Southeast Asia, but there's distinct styles to each of them. One of the things that's kind of unique about the mound building structure and stylistic that, Polynesia tends to have with the Americas is earth based mound building, and then also some rock based, and then there's a mixture of that. There seems to be a transition there, but that's kind of the interesting thing. And that's, I think we severely underestimate how fluid the movement of our ancestors were, and actually how technologically advanced our ancestors were. We think we're the only ones that have this cool technology and we were mobile around the earth. I think we highly underestimate how mobile our ancestors were. There's a lot of talk of the Vikings coming to the Americas well before the Europeans. We also have some evidence of the Chinese making it to the Americas, the Phoenicians. There's a lot of people. It's, right now we're kind of in the dominant Western civilization. So really history reflects an overly, I don't want to say overly, but it highly tends to fall towards a bias towards the West. I am by no means saying West is evil. No, the West has brought some great things. We take those good things, but we also recognize the West is the youngest civilization. It just happens to be the one that matters the most in our days now because that's the most influential. Josh here says, where's Maui? Are you speaking about the individual or location? If you're speaking about Maui, I have no problem saying my bias. The majority of his descendants and heirs are on Tongatapu and in Tonga, but there's a reason why the Hamoa Maui is built on Tongatapu and not anywhere else. So that's kind of my response to that. Water Bear says Maui's in Motunui. Interesting, very interesting. Maui and Motunui with hey. Tony from Facebook. Can you react to a video about Tonga on Plus 64 channel and give us your thoughts? Tony, we did have a response. If you're referring to Plus 64 regards to Christianity and Tonga being forced to take Christianity, we do have a response to that. We haven't edited that live digital kava session into a actual episode on the podcast. Our most recent episode is the first half of the live digital kava session that leads up just before we start reacting to that video. I would probably say our next podcast episode or playlist will be that video, Tony. So if you subscribe to our podcast, you will eventually see that. That's probably going to be our next episode on the podcast. Or you could just search it through. I apologize. We don't name our live digital kava sessions. We just date them. But if you go back 2 or 3 kava sessions, you'll find that video as well. We talk about, in that podcast, we talk about religion, Polynesians, and then we slowly migrate into that Plus 64 with the Samoan brother who played rugby for Manu Samoa, who's the lawyer. We did respond to that. So take a look at that, Tony, real quick. Josh says, not Maui, Maui in your pad. Okay. Maui Tekelagni was here in the States as well. He's in Aotearoa. He is with Mr. Aotearoa in Wellington as we speak. They're over there kind of working on a family celebration. So that's where he is, Josh. Just a heads up on that. Mataafa, Malay Tua. Look forward to today's discussion. Mataafa, as always, great to see you here at the digital kava session. Welcome, welcome. And Nonsky says, Malo Tua. Malo Nonsky. Welcome. All right, guys. Let's jump in to our first part of the show today. So the first part of the show today, we're going to react to a video. Let me see here if I can find it. We're going to react to a video that has made some rounds online. And this video has been presented as quote unquote evidence of a, let's just put it this way, a empire outside of the Tongan Empire and influence that we're going to walk through. And this is where, some of my biggest criticisms of some of the ideas out there is they do a single layer analysis, and then they make these rapid conclusions that say, see, Tonga was nothing, right? Tonga was nothing because look at the language structure and how Tongic is isolated by itself with just Niue, and then you have the nuclear Polynesian language that has Samoa, and it also has Eastern Polynesia, and then they say, see, here's the assumption. And then there's the conclusion that, oh, okay, that doesn't make sense, because a lot of the Tongan, this lady who's going to speak in the video, she's going to ask a question, because Tongan oral history and many oral histories out there says, well, why doesn't make sense? The only, I don't want to say the only, because, you know, we're all human. Nobody knows everything. But the only empire that really has significant evidence behind it is the Tuitonga Empire. There are, granted, there are other oral histories out there. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is there's also a very strong oral history on the Tuitonga Empire, and then physical ruins throughout, and then recorded history. As the Europeans were coming in to Polynesia, they recorded certain rituals, certain gatherings on Tongatapu to the Tuitonga that enters recorded history, even at the Tuitonga Empire's lowest point, right? Like when they came into Polynesia, the Tuitonga Empire was at its lowest point. It was in decline. Civil war was either brewing or actively engaged on Tongatapu and Tonga as a whole. And so once you have that instability at the capital of the empire, everything shrinks, contact and structure dissolves, no different than any other modern nation who goes through a civil war. And the formal government is either dissolved or fractured, and then everybody's just going into survival mode. So with that being said, you know, we're gonna look at this video and just have a quick reaction. And once again, this is a prime example. We have the academics here. We have multiple academics, Polynesian and specifically Tongan academics who are presenting this. And then that gives this credence to this idea that, quote unquote, even Tongan history and Tongan academics are unified in presenting this concept. But it's kind of just it's a weak way. This is why it's important to have conversations. And you know, let's look at this from History Fanatic, and it says the more you delve deep into the history, the more you start to realize that it was not the Tongans who conquered the Pacific, but it was the Samoans. Talatau Tonga, talatofi Samoa. I'm assuming that's some kind of proverb, right? Now, once again, this is the thing that we're going to walk through, right? And we're going to just respond. So they're basically saying that this structure of the Proto-Polynesian languages is evidence that Tonga did not have an empire, and that it was actually a Hamoa empire, which, you know, the most potential one to have an impact would be the Tuimanua. But let's kind of take a look at this, and then we'll continue.
Thank you. I just
let's
question
get it to the
here,
video.
Melanesian from Maunga Koloa, Whalewai.
Thank you. I just looking at her presentation and seeing the beginning of her chart, that it has to the Proto-Polynesian and the Samoic. So
We're going to pause it right there because I think that's important. Let's share this one. And this is the chart that she's referring to, right? So we see the chart here, and it goes the Polynesian, the Proto-Polynesian, and then it splits into two groups. One is the Tongic, right? And it's, as you can see, this is a very short tree. It just goes from the Tongic. There's only two branches under the Tongic, and that's the Tongan and the Niuean branch. On the other side of that, you have the nuclear Polynesian language. In that language, you have two branches. the Samoic Outlier, and then you have the Eastern Polynesian. In the Samoic Outlier, there's the Samoan, Elise, Tokelauan, Tikopian, and even Futuan, right? Which is kind of interesting because I've listened to the Futuna languages and so forth. It's kind of interesting. That seems a lot closer to me than even Samoan. But anyways, then we have the Eastern Polynesian, and that's where you have Rarotongan, Tahitian, Maori, Tuamotuan, and Hawaiian. So kind of your stereotypical Eastern Polynesians. But she's kind of referring to, hey, look at this huge family tree, right, of languages, and then the Tongic language right here. And so now we can see the assumption that's made by the person who created the video. They say, oh, look, this is the Samoan Empire, right? That's what makes sense here. Tongans didn't do anything. And just for anyone out there, okay, I have a lot of Samoan blood, Tongan, and even Fijian blood. So this is not, oh, somehow I only care about Tonga. Hey, dude, we're all one people. We're all the same people. So want to just get that out of the way, because you always get someone who's like, oh, this, or that. No, we're just, once again, we want to have the conversation. And two, we want to make sure that the ideas that we're discussing are the strongest ideas. And if we have a bad idea, kill it. The sooner a bad idea dies, the better. We can learn from the bad ideas. It may bring one or two good things, but at the core, it may be a weak idea. And if at the core it's a weak idea, we need to just slice, dice it, take whatever's good and move on. So let's come back to the video. So that's what she's referring to in the video.
I was wondering why was the Tongan was going down only one, and here the Samoic has all the networking of different languages, total languages. But Tonga seemed to be the warriors of the Pacific. And there's a connection of taking the language. But that's Dr. Tamoifolau. I think I need to go back and review your presentation, because I think it has some connection. I'm wondering why the Tongan was just one going down and not onto many others like the Samoic.
See right there, we go back just
going down.
Go back just a little bit.
I think it has some connection. I'm wondering why the Tongan was just one going down and not onto many others like the Samoic, Tahitian. All the other Polynesian parts have all the languages. So I'm just wondering why Tonga has, maybe they were too dominant or whatever. That's my question. I wonder why was it going down on one as I look at your chart, and the other ones, many. That's my question. Thank you, Dr. Taumefala.
Yeah, I think she's talking about only the Niue is the one that comes through the Tongic, versus the Samoic has multiple languages that derive from it. So we'll turn the time over to you, Dr. Taumefala, for answer.
Malapito maunga. The building of the chart of the subgroups is based on a comparison of all the modern languages. So Samoan is more similar, share more cognates with the rest of the other Polynesian languages. And that's the reason why, and we distinguish Maunga between cognates, which are the inherited forms, and the borrowed words. Words that, and I think you will find that Tongan language has lots and lots of words borrowed by other languages, which indicates that they had been around. You know what I mean? Yeah. Okay, Maunga, I hope that answers your question.
And then it goes into, this video continues into that whole concept there of somehow, see, once again, I want to come back to the concept here of somehow this whole language thing diminishes from the Tongan Empire, which it doesn't, in my opinion. That's what we're going to spend time here today, kind of walking through and discussing that. So don't want to get too far from some of the comments here. It says Futuna and Tokelau sounds more similar to Tongan. Yeah, I would agree. It does sound pretty similar. Here's an interesting comment here. We need to stop saying Pacific. Tuitonga and Manua never made it to East Polynesia. That's, there's a reason why we share the same language and the same religion and a lot of similar customs. That was the last areas to be populated and influenced by the Polynesians. I agree in not saying Pacific because we weren't involved throughout the Pacific. Melanesia and Micronesia have their own unique sets of culture and religion and so forth, with some influence cross-Polynesian with Polynesian, but the Polynesian triangle has some very specific aspects that unites us across the board. You also say that the original language is very Samoic outlier. We're going to get into that, Josh. We're going to get into that. We're going to dive into that a little bit more. It's Dendis says, I don't think Tonga had to conquer anyone because they were descendants of the founders of the whole. I'm open to that, Dendis. I kind of lean towards that. Now, does that mean there weren't some scuffles here and there? No, there were, but for all intents and purposes, there was a unification under it. I am open to the idea, though, Dendis, that there may have been, and I'll explain this idea a little bit more before we get into the languages a little bit more. I am open to the idea that there may have been people already populated on the islands, right? And what could be one of the scenarios that could explain what happened is that Tangaloa, Maui, and the Taulas, they come into the Pacific or to Polynesia, and it's already populated. That's where you get all this Southeast Asian blood. That's where you get a lot of this Melanesian blood. But Maui, Tangaloa, and the Taulas come. They're an outside civilization from the mound building civilization. They establish themselves on Tongatapu, and then they spread. So they are the core group. I commonly refer to them as the founding fathers of the Polynesian Empire. And I don't feel that they had to go around and conquer. I believe that they brought superior technology, a very structured way to organize government and religion. And then through exploration and colonizing of the islands, so to speak, and intermarrying into leading families throughout the Polynesian islands, they established a network of the kingdom that eventually led to a structure of governors and lower kings throughout the different islands that had a connection to Tongatapu and therefore drove the government, the religion, the culture that is now known as Polynesian. So that's kind of my thoughts on that as well. I don't disagree, Josh. Yeah, Pacific, probably, yeah, it's thousands of islands. I don't disagree with that. Let me see here. Nonsky says it's definitely clear when you see these people and their assumptions, nothing clear at all, just there's muddy to muddy the water. I agree, but that's the thing. They muddy the waters and then they say, oh, see, this means this. No, you have to actually sit down and have some conversations and walk through some of these ideas. Let's see here. Renegade says Samoans migrated to a lot of islands. Later on, Tonga's language is similar to more islands than just Niue. I would agree with that, but the academics and the science behind it, I'm sure they have their structuring reasons, and we'll kind of walk through some of those. but that's just the way they've decided to structure it. But even Renegade, even in the way that they structure it, there's different ways to interpret the data, and it doesn't just lean one way. And actually, even the data they provide makes room and actually gives some credence to the Tuitonga Empire, and there's some ways to explain the differences. So with that being said, appreciate the comments. Couldn't get to all of them, but we're going to walk through. So we had our good buddy, Mr. Grok himself, Super Grok, do some analysis. And we ran two scenarios. We did the deep search, and then we also did the thinking critically. And we ran through both of those. So here it went through 36 sources. And basically, we asked Grok and said, Grok, how should I understand the relationship of the Tongic language from Tonga in relation to the Samoic language from Samoa and the rest of Polynesia in regards to which language is older and how they interacted with each other and any other patterns to understand how the languages developed? So we asked Grok. I don't care what anyone says. Some people, it's kind of silly. The same people who say, Grok and AI is kind of silly to use, but then they'll go and search Google and read some crazy stuff as well. So I'm a big fan of using AI. It tends to be more logical. It covers, look at all the data sources here that it goes through. AI has passed the LSAT, GMAT, passed the bar. A lot of these AIs are pretty smart. You got to be wise with it. It doesn't mean everything the AI says is 100%, gold. You still got to use some critical thinking. And like some here I'm seeing the comments, use the data online. But guys, that's fair, and we'll walk through it. So we're just going to walk through some of the data points. So the key points that Grok's going to come up with. It says research suggests Tongic or Tongan and Samoan languages diverged from the Proto-Polynesian around 2,500 years ago. So neither is definitely older. And then the next point, it says, it seems likely that historical interactions, especially Tongan dominance, led to language contact with Tongan influencing Samoan through loan words, right? Then it says, the evidence leans towards both languages sharing many similarities but being distinct, with Tongan retaining some archaic features like the glottal stop. So I want to just walk through those 3 points. So pretty much it's saying they have the same origin. Looks like the Tongan language has more loan words given to the other languages, right? But then it also shows here the evidence leans towards both languages sharing many similarities but being distinct, with Tongan retaining some archaic features like the glottal stop. So that to me is very interesting. The question that comes to my mind is, why? Why did the Tongan language maintain more of the archaic forms of the language? And I think that's important. I think that's something we need to keep in mind as we go through this. That's a fair question. They seem to be of similar origins. Neither one is older than the other, but somehow they've diverged. What caused the diversion? Obviously the video we saw says, it's because there was a Samoan empire. But when you look at oral history, you look at ruins, you look at even recorded history, very little evidence for that. We have a little bit more for the Tongan Empire. But I think the fact that they're saying that the Tongan language retains more of the archaic forms of the Proto-Polynesian language is really important. So we'll go through the first part. It says, language, age, and relationship. Both Tongic and Samoic languages are part of the Polynesian family, which originated from Proto-Polynesian spoken in the Tonga Samoa area. They split around the same time, so it's not accurate to say one is older than the other. Instead, they developed in parallel, with Tongic, including Tongan and Niuean, and Samoic being part of the larger nuclear Polynesian branch, which also includes East Polynesia languages like Hawaiian and Maui. Okay. Something that's kind of interesting there, right? Especially when you say the Hawaiian and the Maori, those are two languages. Well, Hawaiian was basically died for all intents and purposes as a language, had to be resurrected. And then the Maori either came very close to dying and had to be resurrected, but both came either close to death or died as a language. And I think that there's some reasoning behind how this whole separate group of the language morphed. But they come from the same origin and they developed in parallel. Historical interaction. It says here, historical interaction and influence. Historical record shows significant contact, particularly during the Tuitonga Empire's influence over Samoa, which likely led to Tongan loan words in Samoan, such as alu, walk. This suggests Tongan had a cultural and linguistic impact during periods of dominance through Samoa later regained independence, potentially reducing direct influence. Okay. We're not going to go through this whole idea of Samoa gaining independence. We will have a future episode that talks about the Tuna and Fata whole situation there. But we're just talking about the language. So these two languages split, but then and they're developing in parallel, and then they're saying one language had dominance over the other and has loan words. But that's the interesting thing. If that's the case, then that means the whole Samoic string of languages have borrowed words from the Tongic string of languages. And we don't necessarily have the reverse of that. It seems to be more one way, which once again is another evidence that lean towards dominance of the Tuitonga Empire, which is wildly accepted across the board. Let's see here. Development patterns. Both languages share vocabulary and grammar due to their common origin, but they have distinct features. Tongan retains the glottal stop, the whakaua, right? A feature lost. See, we're starting to see this. As we mentioned earlier with the Maori and the Hawaiian language here, right? So a lot of influence there. It says that the feature lost in many of the other Polynesian languages, while both merge certain words like R and L into L. These differences highlight their unique evolutionary paths within Polynesia. Okay. The question is, once again, this is arising as to what was the different paths that we're talking about here. So they're evolving, especially with the concept of, do we believe our ancestors were migrating back and forth for many, many thousands of years, or do we believe that was not the case? We will continue down here. Survey note, understanding the relationship between Tongic and Samoan languages in Polynesia. This survey note provides a comprehensive analysis of the relationship between the Tongic language from Tonga and the Samoic language from Samoa, focusing on their age, historical interactions, and patterns of development within the broader Polynesian linguistic context. The discussion is informed by historical, archaeological, and linguistic evidence aiming to address the user's query in detail. Okay. Linguistics classification and age. The Polynesian languages are a subgroup of the Austronesian language family, with Tongic and Samoic representing two key branches. According to linguistic studies, the ancestors of modern Polynesia settled in the Tonga Samoa area around 3,000 years ago. So this is kind of the common theme when you're looking around throughout Polynesia in the history and origins. It seems to be pretty uniform across the board. Everyone agrees Tonga Samoa is the kind of the origin areas. Now, as of recent, the Samoan cradle of Polynesia seems to have gotten more attention as of the recent years. a lot of our perspectives diverges from that. We don't think there's a lot of evidence besides oral history that supports that position, but hey, we're here to discuss and explore that as much as we can. Undergoing common development for about 1,000 years, leading to Proto-Polynesian, the ancestor of all modern Polynesian languages. Okay, so this is something that I think is important. So there was a unified language for they're saying at least 1,000 years. Okay, then there's a split, and they're saying that the Tongic language is truer to the archaic form of the Proto-Polynesian than the Samoic languages. I translate that as Tongic is truer to the original Proto-Polynesian language than the Samoic ones. As they were unified for 1,000 years, they split. Then there is a radical change. The Tongic remains truer to the original Proto-Polynesian language, while the Samoic one goes through a more radical change. Question is, what's causing the differentiation there? Right? And so that's something that I think is really important. We're starting to see a theme here. Tongic language maintains its archaic form a lot better than the Samoic branch. And we'll kind of, get through some of my thoughts on that and visit some of the comments here as we get through. Around 2,500 years ago, Proto-Polynesian began to split, giving rise to two main branches. Tongic, comprising of Tongan and Niue, this branch is considered more conservative, retaining certain archaic features of Proto-Polynesian, such as the glottal stop, which many other Polynesian languages, including Samoan, have lost. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this over and over again. Proto-Polynesian language, 1,000 years, and the dates and the timelines may be wrong. I think it was much longer than that, but for the sake of this discussion, we'll keep it to their timelines. 1,000 years of unified language. At some point, it splits. When the split happens, Tongic remains more of the archaic features and is more conservative, reflecting the older Proto-Polynesian language structure. The Samoic side starts to lose some of the archaic features of the Proto-Polynesian language. Okay, I think that's important. This is not Samoan language was more dominant, that's why there's more. No. It's actually the other way around. The borrowed words are more on the Samoic side, borrowing from the Tongic side, not the other way around. And they express those loan words because of Tongic dominance of the Tuitonga Empire. So those are two really important things. The borrowing of the word seems to be one way, and the remaining true to the Proto-Polynesian language is on the Tongic side. Okay, so I think that's something that's really important to keep track of. Okay, on the nuclear Polynesian, that's where the Samoic language comes from. Include Samoan and all other Polynesian languages, further dividing into subgroups like Samoic, Outlier, and Eastern Polynesian. This branch has undergone more diversification, suggesting a broader spread and evolution. I'm going to come back to this. The nuclear Polynesian that has the Samoic and the Eastern Polynesian, what do they say is the driving feature for it? This branch has undergone more diversification, broader spread, and evolution. There is a rapid change in the language. That is what is driving that. The rapid change in the language. Now, why is it? Now let's just come back to this. Historically speaking, when we look at our ancestors, what was the big split? what is the biggest cause of change and diversification of history, governance, maintaining of social and ancient structures like language, not just language, but also cultural practices? We can't help but think there's only one of these groups that maintained independence from the very beginning. All of our other brothers and sisters had gone through a more rapid and radical change. We know we're talking about the language, but when we zoom out, radical change in political structure, religious structure, cultural structure, all driven by colonization. Okay. That is what I am starting to see as the driver behind the diversification and the evolution of these languages. Right? So, no, the groupings, the reason why it's a bigger grouping of languages is not because, it was Samoic dominance and colonization within the Polynesian groups. No. It seems like this is more along rapid change. And the change that we can think of that we have documented for sure historically is colonization. That's what we see. So, yeah, that's what I'm kind of, when we go through this whole thing, it actually, to me, one could make the argument that the linguistical structure further validates the Tuitonga Empire's influence, because the borrowed words are one-dimensional, from the Tongic to the nuclear Polynesian, which has Samoic and Eastern Polynesia. The borrowing of the words is one-way street, and then one side maintained its independence and its truthfulness closer to the Proto-Polynesian ancestral language. All right, let's continue here. Given this timeline, neither Tongan nor Samoan is older than the other, as both diverged from the Proto-Polynesian simultaneously. However, Tongic's smaller size, only in 2 languages, contrasts with nuclear Polynesian's extensive diversification, which might suggest different rates of linguistic evolution, but not age. Let's see here. Seeing a lot of comments here. I'm going to try and power through this without getting too distracted. But once again, the diversification and the radical changes of the linguistical side of things is actually the driver and the explanation for the changes in the languages. Historical interaction and language contact. Historical interactions between Tonga and Samoa have significantly shaped their linguistic relationship. Samoan oral traditions suggest that Tonga was once under the dominion of the Tuimanua. Yeah, okay. All right. We're going to keep it in there. We're having a different conversation, but, paying tribute. But by the 10th century, the Tuitonga Empire supplanted this, exerting influence over Samoa. In the 13th century, the Tuitonga Talakai Faiki brought Samoa under direct control, establishing a capital at Safotu in Savaii, but was later expelled by the progenitors of the Malietoa dynasty, leading to Samoa's independence. Despite this, intermarriages between the Tongan and Samoan chiefly lines continued, as seen with Ngata, the progenitor of the current Tonga royal dynasty, Tuikanukupolu being of Samoan descent. Well, I mean, here's a comment right here, right? Oh, now you read that you don't believe it, shaking my head. You pick and choose what you want to believe. I pick and choose across the board. Okay. And anyone who says they don't pick and choose, it doesn't. This is we don't have a lot of physical evidence. The reason why I shake my head, very little physical evidence for this. So that's the reason why. But like I said, we don't want to get too distracted by that. But anyways, we'll continue here. We can have that conversation once we get through this if we want to. Easy. This historical contact is reflected in linguistic evidence. Studies such as those by Paul Gerardi identify Tongan loanwords in Samoan, such as alu, indicating that during periods of Tongan dominance, there was significant language contact with Tongan influencing Samoan. Additionally, Tongan names for Samoan words like kokupolu or upolu suggest long-term familiarity and interaction, potentially facilitating lexical borrowing. All right. Yeah. I mean, let me put it this way. There's a lot of different things here that I don't necessarily agree with, but the overall concept we're going to allow here just to get through the idea here. Patterns in language development. The development of the Tongic and Samoic languages shows both shared and distinct patterns reflecting their common origin and subsequent divergence. Phonetical features. Both Tongan and Samoan are part of the West Polynesian subgroup, where Proto-Polynesian R and L merged into L, unlike East Polynesian languages, which often use R. Tongan, however, retained the glottal stop, a feature lost in Samoan and many other Polynesian languages, making it phonetically more conservative. Grammatical similarities. Both languages are a basic Austronesian structure, including verb, subject, object, word order, and extensive use of particles for tense and aspect, reflecting their common Proto-Polynesian heritage. Lexical similarities and differences. There are many shared vocabulary items due to their common origin, such as kava, or ava for kava, and fale for house. However, differences exist, such as puaka, Tongan, and pua'a, Samoan for pig. Similar. I mean, to me, that's just more of a pronunciation deal, but okay. Often involving sound shifts like the addition or omission of K in Tongan. These differences highlight their distinct evolutionary paths, with some studies suggesting Tongan and Samoan are as different as Spanish and Portuguese, yet with enough similarity for partial and mutual intelligibility. Okay, so they go through some of the words here. I'm going to skip through that. Broader Polynesian context. Within Polynesia, Tongic and Samoic are central to understanding the region's linguistic history. The Polynesian Triangle, defined by Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, encloses Polynesian proper, with Tonga and Samoa at its core. The Polynesian outliers, spoken in Melanesia and Micronesia, also show connections, with some traced back to Samoa, suggesting a complex network of interactions. This network likely facilitated further linguistic exchange, reinforcing the influence seen between Tongan and Samoan. Okay, conclusion. In summary, Tongic and Samoic languages are not older than each other, having diverged from the Proto-Polynesian around 2,500 years ago. I'm not necessarily buying the 2,500 years ago. Just like you do DNA studies, you know, there are 2 to 3 different schools of thought on how to interpret the aging of DNA material. But anyways, for this purpose, we're not going to get into that. Historical interactions, particularly Tongan dominance, led to language contact, with Tongan influencing Samoan through loanwords. Their development shows shared origin with distinct features such as Tongan's retention of the glottal stop, reflecting their unique paths within Polynesia. The analysis provides a comprehensive view of their relationship, highlighting both their unity and diversity. Anyways, I think this was, the main point I wanted to get out of this is a single point or single line analysis that somehow the grouping of more Samoic languages meant Samoan dominance. That is just one of the weakest ideas you can take. And this is what happens when you just take it looks like it's, grouped together. That means there's a Samoan dominance and the Tongan dominance didn't exist. Wrong, right? The only evidence for dominance is actually one way, Tongan on the Samoic. And then when you look at it, it is the Tongic languages were more conservative and maintained its conservative structure compared to the Samoic and the Eastern Polynesian, and that really the driver behind the separation of the languages is evolution and change in the language. And so one could easily look at colonization as the driver behind that radical change. And it could happen much quicker and in a smaller amount of time, hundreds of years, rather than the thousands of years that seems to be the general accepted position there. So let's see. Lot of questions here, guys. If there's, I'm gonna, now that we're kind of gotten through the article itself, if there's any specific questions that want to be brought up, we can kind of re-enter it here at the bottom of the chat. There's just been a lot of activity. Great to see everyone talking and sharing ideas. But it's well, see, here's an interesting one. Toko, maybe exclude data from Wikipedia for prompt for Grok because it's mostly inaccurate history. I understand what you're saying, UTOL, but here's the problem. One could easily say that about oral history, right? One could easily say that about Kava sessions. One can easily say that about the stories that you heard since you were a little kid. We understand, you know, Wikipedia is a community driven. It can be influenced. It's not, but I also see that with quote unquote academic studies as well, where the academic study is driven more by personal interest of the academic, right? The drive to come up with a new idea as being more important than coming up with the truth. So we throw the ideas in. That's why, you know, I think Easy was saying, oh, you pick and choose. Well, because it's like when you hear a story, some parts of the story might be true, and then other parts of the story might be just for entertainment value purposes. And so if you throw the whole story out, that might be unwise, but accepting the entire story may be unwise too. So you have to use a little bit of wisdom and judgment. No one's ever going to perfectly manage 100% accuracy, but we can just navigate through that. Let's see here. Let me see here. Josh here seems to be pretty passionate today. You can't just say it's colonization. You're really disrespecting other cultures and language because you want to get a one up on someone. What else would be the explanation, Josh, in your thoughts? You know, how else would you explain the radical changes there? That would be my question. We don't have any other recorded history. We don't have documented within our own oral history. But what we do know is colonization resulted in radical change. And if the study says the divergence of the languages is not from different origins or that one's older than the other, it is more driven by diversification and changes in the language, what else can we come up with an idea on what would drive that? You know, I'm open to any ideas on that, Josh. If you're saying that, you know, we're just bringing up colonization as a one-up, no, that's just like the most immediate response to that. If there's other ideas for it, would love to hear that. But that's kind of the initial kind of reaction to that concept. So that's that portion of the discussion here. Wanted to walk through. There's a lot of discussion going back and forth here on YouTube. So great discussion there. Looks like Water Bears, Josh, Easy, and the team here are having a great time discussing things and having a good conversation. So that's great. So I think for the second half of the show, we're coming up on the first hour. We're going to discuss a topic here that I think is really important to understand. And this is this is something. Let's see some questions here. I'm going to try and just buy in some time here. Before I move on to the other topic, it says Meleka says Tokelau language is under the Samoic outlier languages, but a lot of the languages in this group is not understood by Tokelau people, but not Samoan people. Not 100% sure on what you're trying to get there, Meleka. If you're saying that, you know, the Tokelau language is not as similar to Samoan as it's indicated, I'll come back to what was the discussion earlier, Meleka, is those groupings of languages is not always necessarily how similar they are, but the similar radical changes away from the Proto-Polynesian parent language that they seem to say that the Tongic language branch is a lot closer to the Proto-Polynesian origin language. So the way you could possibly interpret the groupings is not necessarily that they come from the same source as the Samoic, but they've gone through similar changes over time, and the morphing of the language is one way you could look at it. Let's see. All right. With that being said, this is something that I think is also an important conversation to have. I'm going to pull this up here, and we're going to listen to a podcast of kind of walking through the Talakai Faiki, quote unquote, liberation of Hamoa and how that conversation goes. Let me see here if I can find the video. Looks like there's another question here. Josh says, why would you group Samoic and East Polynesian changes together when East Polynesia is linked straight from the source? I don't know what you mean from the source. What's the source, Josh? I don't fully understand. Why would you group Samoic and East Polynesian changes together when East Polynesian is linked straight from the source? I don't know exactly what you mean by source. Oh, nuclear. Okay. Maybe that's something I'm not clear on. I'm not sure on how, when, you know, from the data that I looked at, how it says that Eastern Polynesian is closer to nuclear Polynesian than Samoic. You know, just from that split on the nuclear, it seems to be a separation. Yeah, let's look at the chart. Okay, let's come back to the chart here. Nope. Where is it? Okay. Right here. So let's bring this back up. So there. Yeah. So in this chart, if you're saying, yeah, it's closer to here, to me, the way I understand what we walk through, Josh, is the Tongic is a lot closer to the Proto-Polynesian, maintaining that kind of like archaic form. This branch is a diversification and morphing of the language at a more rapid pace than the Tongic. This is why the glottal stop is lost, right? That the language on the nuclear Polynesian is more of a morphing and changing. That's what kind of the data we were looking at was saying, that there was a faster evolutionary. Oh, let me come down to this table right here. So you have the Proto-Polynesian. The Tongic line stays more conservative, right? So really the split is this one stays more conservative. The nuclear Polynesian is more about rapid change in the language. So it is a diversification and rapid change. So as we come down here, there's two splits in that rapid change. Samoic outlier has its own outline of diversification and separation away from the Proto-Polynesian, and the Eastern Polynesian has its own, right? One could make the argument, the Samoic language could have had a slower change or radicalization or evolutionary because it was of closer proximity to Tonga, and that was as the Polynesian Empire shrinks, right? And Maui Tekelagni likes to use this metaphor, is if you have a tree and the tree grows, the root is the origin or the cradle of the civilization. Then you have the body, and then you have the branches. As the tree dies, the further away you are from the root, the more rapid the decay. So you could look at it as Eastern Polynesia being further away from Samoa and Tonga would deteriorate much quicker. Then you would have what's closer to Samoa and Tonga have some deterioration, but not as quickly as the others. And then obviously the Tongan, from our perspective, would have been the root, has the least amount of decay and closest to the Proto-Polynesian language. So that's why I took that position there, Josh, and that's the explanation for it from my perspective. So this is an exercise in slowest decay, much quicker decay or morphing of the language, right? Much faster than the Tongic, and then between the Samoic and the Eastern Polynesia being even further away, had more radical changes in the same amount of time than the Samoic. We have another comment here. Logically, that chart would be somewhat accurate. I mean, easy. I mean, I don't know, man. Like maybe. I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming. What I'm trying to do is I don't necessarily agree with a lot of this. All I'm trying to do, easy, as we walk through this, is use their own framework of thinking to say, if this is accurate, which I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I'm just, they call it steel manning, I guess. If I concede to you that you are correct in your analysis of the languages, like I said, I don't agree with the thousands of years of separation. I think it's shorter amount of time than that. But anyways, whatever. Neither here nor there. But I'm just assuming this is accurate. As you mentioned, as we've heard from other comments here from people from Tokelau and all these, they have their own thoughts. They say, hey, we actually think these languages sound a lot closer to Tongic or whatever. Could be not. I think Uvea and Futuna sound a lot more like Tongan than Hamoa, than Samoan. But that's just me. But they have this set up as Uvea and Futuna sounding more like Samoic, right? So, with that being said, looks like Meleka has returned. Sorry, I meant Tokelau understand Tuvalu, Puka Puka. Uvea, but Samoan language is different. They can't speak our. Yeah, I don't know. I don't disagree with that, Meleka. This is just this is what they came up with, right? I'm not saying it's 100% accurate. I'm just trying to enter into the way they view it and try to say, hey, if you are right, how could we interpret this data? Let's see here. It says here, why does central northern outlier islands who were never colonized have closer language to East Polynesians, and I can understand them? I'm not sure who are those northern outlier islands who were never colonized. As far as I understand, there's only one nation in the Pacific that was never colonized, and that's Tonga. So I'm not 100% sure on that question, Josh. Josh says, I agree with what you're saying, but saying colonization was the drive is false. I mean, what would be your thoughts on that? I'm open to that, Josh. I can't think of anything else. Tell me something else that you would say would drive such a radical change, in my opinion. When you piece it all together, Maui. Let's see if there's any other questions here that we'll go through before we go to the next portion. Here's another question. Renegade says, will we see Cialci Ilaiu back on the podcast? Yes. Cialci said he is open for more conversations. It's just a matter of working out schedules, Renegade. I think what we'll do next is actually when we have the next opportunity to have Cialci join, we'll just have him choose a topic of his preference and interest. I think he provided a lot of different ideas that we could dive into, and just have him share his perspective, the history, the oral history that he found. What I find very intriguing about Cialci Ilaiu is the fact that he has traveled to a lot of these islands and spoke with these people directly, right? I find that very intriguing. I find that very valuable. And the fact that he's visited so many of these islands and spoke to them face to face is critical. And then you add to that a lot of his history. Obviously, we have different perspectives than he has on certain ideas. You know, like one interesting thing, and we're, you know, the second portion of the show, we're going to walk through the oral history. There's a podcast that walks through the discussion of Talakai, Faiki, and Tuna and Fata, and that whole situation. He has a unique perspective and idea there that actually I had kind of thought about a little bit, but never really fully developed. So I was shocked that Cialci Ilaiu shared that he had found oral history and evidence that the issue, and this may be a good transition in the next portion of the show. He says that the issue between Talakai, Faiki and Tuna and Fata was a religious one. Okay, very interesting. He says that the issue at the time wasn't necessarily oppression. It was that Talakai, Faiki wanted to put more emphasis on Hikuleo as a god rather than Tangaloa, and that was actually the driver of the tension between Tuna, Fata, and some of our Samoan brothers and sisters with Talakai, Faiki, was that religious change that he wanted to institute into the Polynesian Empire. Easy says, can you talk about King Tupou changing the Tongan alphabet? Are you talking about Tupou IV and how he restructured it? I don't have a lot of knowledge on that, Easy. Besides, I do know that they made changes to the alphabet to better represent the phonetics of the language, like taking out the R's. You know, when in the traditional Tongan Bible, even to this day, the spelling of it is from the early translations. They didn't change a lot of the words, and so there's more R's and so forth, and J's, I think, in the old Tongan Bible, that Tupou IV instituted a phonetic system that was much closer to how Tongans understood the sounds. Obviously, with the Bible being translated, a lot of that was influenced by Europeans. Once again, coming back to colonization, in that, you know, you change, the Europeans make the best efforts that they can to replicate the sounds that they hear and understand based off of how they write and understand things. And so there were a lot of letters that were used in the original translation of the Bible that didn't really match up with how Tongans made pronunciations. So he created a phonetic system for Tongan to better match, like the nga, the ng, right? The old Tongan Bible just had a G. He adds the ng because that's much closer to how the actual Tongans pronounce that word or letter phonetically. Let's see here. Yeah, 100% agreed there, UTOL. It is much more like a D. It's like a half D/T. You know, obviously in Hamoa, it's much more of a T. In Tonga, it's like a cross between a D and a T. Let's see. All right. I think that pretty much 100%. I don't disagree with that, Josh. Colonization also affected Tonga, just not physically. Well, in a sense, it did physically, but just not as much, right? Tonga had to adapt. If Tonga didn't learn how to adapt, Tonga would have been colonized, right? That's why certain parts of the culture was, in a sense, lost. But at the same time, culture is always changing. What it meant to be Tongan 500 years ago was not the same thing as Tongan as 1,000 years ago. Culture is always changing. You're always making those evolutions in the culture and in the language. So you're always going to give something up, right? So yeah. You know what, guys? Here's one thing. We're going to close with this. April was our most interactive month of all time for the podcast, and especially on YouTube. Typically we get a lot of our engagement on TikTok, and that's usually been our kind of most interactive comments, shares, and so forth, and views. April, for whatever reason, was just off the charts. I mean, I'm talking about triple to quadruple of our views, comments, and so forth. So really appreciate everyone's willingness to comment, share, subscribe. It goes a long way. We're steadily reaching towards hopefully one day we'll get a better mic. It's either that or I need to tone down my voice. I get it. Seems like it's kind of getting out of control here, but great month. We're marching towards 1,000 subscribers, marching on YouTube. We're getting close to, I think we're marching towards 2,000, maybe 3,000, 2 or 3,000 on TikTok. But really appreciate everyone's feedback and in the comments. Once again, as always, our position is we are one people. We have always been one people. We are, in many ways, still one nation, though we've been kind of sliced and diced, and we have different flags and we have different governments. But that doesn't change the fact that we are all related, literally, physically related, and then also we share the same cultural, religious, and kind of traditional belief systems. And it's really important that more of our people have these conversations, to really just deep dive, have conversations, and really explore what our ancestors did. I really do believe, our Polynesian people are going to turn the corner. I feel like we're going to have we already have a huge impact on the world. Overall, I know the most obvious one is in sports, but we're spreading into entertainment, we're spreading into politics, we're spreading into content creation, and for a small group of people who lived on small specks of land on the largest ocean, it's miraculous. We definitely have a lot to contribute to this world, and a big place to start to do that is to have more conversations, help us understand the great history that we share, that will hopefully drive us together to be more unified, because the more unified we are, the greater the impact we'll have in the culture of the world overall. I think we will bring a lot of stability and bring back a lot of the craziness that we see out there. With that being said, as always, be bold. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. And until next time, peace.